That's a very good question.
Finding patterns of evidence that match
or our Facebook Live feed. To our television viewers, a warm welcome to those of you tuning in through Catholic TV, WTN, at Madarshan TV, Sultan Light TV. And those of you tuning in through radio, especially the listeners joining us through Luminous Radio. And to all of you joining us through other internet digital sites. In the past, this meeting took place from the Sala Regia. Our Pope Francis today is receiving the Diplomatic Corps for the first time in the Aula della Benedizione, or the Hall of Blessing, located on the level above the vestibule of the Basilica, from which the balcony is accessed, from which he normally gives his Urbi et Orbi address. Our Holy Father is taking his seat and has motioned for all the diplomats present to take theirs as well. Our Holy Father will first be greeted by the Dean of the Diplomatic Corps, Mr. George Poulides, the Ambassador of Cyprus to the Holy See. Currently, there are 183 states that have diplomatic relations with the Holy See, and to those can be included the European Union, the Sovereign Military Order of Malta. 88 countries have embassies here in Rome.
Grazie.
And here we should be hearing from the Dean of the Diplomatic Corps. He'll be speaking in French, if I'm not mistaken.
Très Saint-Père, je suis très honoré
Your Holiness,
de vous présenter en qualité
as Dean of the Diplomatic Corps, accredited to the Holy See,
accrédité près le Saint-Siège, nos vœux les meilleurs de bonne santé.
I am deeply honored and moved to express to you our best wishes for your good health and the fruitful continuance of your apostolic mission.
Permettez-moi d'exprimer la joie de pouvoir vivre ensemble.
Allow me to express our joy at being able to gather for this traditional meeting, even though it takes place in particular conditions arising from the need to respect sanitary regulations. This meeting fills our hearts with hope and, in a symbolic way, presents to the world the representatives of states gathered around you, the Holy Father.
L'année 2020 a été marquée par la grande crise mondiale de la pandémie.
The year 2020 was marked by the great global crisis of the COVID-19 pandemic.
Qui s'est dramatiquement transformée en crise sociale et économique.
This pandemic has dramatically evolved into a social and economic crisis and has invaded every area of human life. Despite the difficulties, Your Holiness, you ceaselessly continued to carry out your activities as you brought to those in anxiety and need the consolation and encouragement of your word. Also, by making astute use of the communications media.
n'a jamais manqué, malgré les limitations imposées par la pandémie.
Despite the limits imposed by the pandemic, thanks to the media
Nous avons senti
and other means,
très proche.
your spiritual guidance never wavered. We felt the closeness of your presence and your prayer for suffering humanity.
Oublier le moment extraordinaire de prière
We cannot forget the extraordinary moment of prayer in a time
avec
of
les images de
pandemic
la place Saint-Pierre
with the images of St. Peter's Square
lorsque
on the 27th of March last,
se retrouvait
during
dans
which
notre visage
all of humanity recognized itself
en ce lieu
in your presence, in your person, all alone,
et de joie,
in places normally throbbing with life and joy, and now unexpectedly gray and deserted.
donner une réponse au désarroi,
On that day,
souffrance,
you responded
inquiétude
to the
qui était
consternation, suffering, and concern which all of us were feeling.
paroles ont raffermi nos cœurs épeurés.
Your words cheered our heart
Nous indiquons désormais une voie pour l'avenir.
as you indicated a path for the future.
Nous nous rendons compte que nous nous trouvons
And he now quotes from the Holy Father's discourse.
et désorientés.
We have become aware that we are in the same boat.
Tous importants
We are all fragile and disoriented, but at the same time, we are all important and needed. We are all called to row together.
nous sommes
Unquote.
tous dans le même bateau de l'humanité.
Yes, we are all in the same boat of humanity,
Oublié.
even though we have often forgotten it.
Nous retrouver ici aujourd'hui avec vous, sainteté,
To be here with you today, Your Holiness,
manifester
demonstrates,
le fait
in a way,
les peuples, les femmes et les hommes sont tous frères.
the effect that all peoples and all men and
Le
women
même bateau
have,
d'humanité.
that we are all brothers and sisters in the same boat
Générale
of
se
humanity.
focalise exclusivement sur l'évolution de la pandémie.
While the general attention focused exclusively on the evolution of the pandemic, you turned your gaze also to the other causes of suffering in the world.
Conflits, changement climatique, inégalité
Conflicts, climate change, inequalities, heightened by the throwaway culture
globalisation de l'indifférence.
and the globalization of indifference.
5 ans après la publication de l'encyclique Laudato Si, dont laquelle
5 years after the publication of the encyclical Laudato Si, in which you drew attention
cri de la terre,
to the cry of the earth and of the poor,
nous pouvons tous constater
we can all see for ourselves,
des événements actuels
in the light of current
combien il
events,
s'agit d'un texte prophétique.
how much this text is a prophetic and realistic one.
Il nous avertit en effet sur les conséquences de l'exploitation
Indeed, in it, you warned us of the consequences of the indiscriminate exploitation of the planet,
origine des graves dommages.
which causes grave harm to humanity.
Saint-Père, en cette année durant laquelle nous avons été
Holy Father, in the past year during which we were hard hit and disoriented,
à suivre,
you showed us the path to follow
octobre dernier,
when
votre troisième
you signed your third encyclical,
tutti,
Fratelli Tutti, on October 3rd last in Assisi.
de promouvoir un désir universel
You did so in order to promote a universal aspiration to fraternity
en reconnaissant la
and
dignité
social friendship,
de toute
recognizing the dignity of every human person.
L'encyclique est aussi une boussole pour l'action diplomatique qui, à travers la culture,
The encyclical is also a compass for diplomatic activity, which, through a culture of encounter and dialogue, seeks to overcome differences, divisions, and obstacles to integral human development and the care of the common good.
l'encyclique est aussi une grande leçon
The encyclical also provides an important lesson
diplomate
for us,
dans notre service.
diplomats in our service.
Permettez-moi d'évoquer
Holy Father,
la
allow me
clairvoyance de vos appels
to refer to the farsightedness of your repeated appeals to states and international organizations,
aux entreprises du domaine sanitaire,
and even to healthcare companies
l'apparition de la pandémie,
since the beginning of the pandemic,
pour que l'accès du vaccin soit universel et
to ensure that access to vaccines will be universal
je voudrais rappeler les paroles
and that they will be available to everyone.
d'Occasion
I wish
message
to recall what you said
Orbi.
in your Christmas Urbi et Orbi message,
Pas permettre
and he
les
quotes,
nationalismes fermés
"We cannot allow the various forms of nationalism
familles
closed in on themselves to prevent us from living as the true human family that we are.
virus de l'individualisme
Nor can we allow the virus of radical individualism
nous rend indifférents
to get the better of us and make us indifferent
frères et sœurs.
to the suffering of our brothers and sisters," unquote.
Sainteté. Nous nous souviendrons de l'année que nous laissons derrière nous
Your Holiness, we will remember the year which we have left behind us and the sufferings it brought.
pouvoir transformer la paix
We believed we could fashion the earth
sans avoir
without respecting it,
et nous avons oublié que nous faisons partie
and we forgot
nature.
that we are part of the nature that surrounds us.
Regardons vers l'année nouvelle. Vous avez jeté
As you looked towards the new year,
de nouveaux
you
départs
sowed the seed of hope
nous suggérons
for a new beginning
l'occasion de la 54e journée mondiale
when, on the occasion of the 54th World Day of Peace,
de mettre au centre de notre agir la culture du
you
saint,
suggested that we should place the culture of care
de la dignité
at the heart of our activity. This implies promoting the dignity of each human person,
avec les pauvres,
solidarity with the poor and the vulnerable,
la sollicitude pour le bien commun
the pursuit of the common good,
de la création.
and concern for the protection of creation," unquote.
Je vous remercie encore pour votre ministère en faveur de l'humanité.
Once again, I thank you for your ministry for the benefit, or that benefits all humanity.
La valeur de façon
During the past year, we appreciated its importance in a particular way.
vous prie, très Saint-Père, d'accepter au nom
On behalf of the diplomatic corps
accrédité présidentiel
accredited to the Holy See,
les plus fervents de bonne santé et de
I renew our most fervent best wishes for a happy new year and good health, your Holy Father. Our Holy Father now on his feet and making his way toward the Dean, George Poulides, who, as we see, has delivered his address from a wheelchair, so our Holy Father has gone to him to greet him. We've heard a bit from this Dean of the Diplomatic Corps, the activities of our Holy Father that have particularly touched them in this last year, in their own work in representing their countries here to the Holy See and through which the Holy See interacts with their countries, 183 states now having diplomatic relations. We will now hear Pope Francis discourse. This meeting should have taken place on the 25th of January, and it was postponed. As we remember, our Holy Father was suffering from a bout of sciatica.
Eccellenze, signore e signori.
Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I thank the Dean, His Excellency George Pulids, Ambassador of Cyprus, for the kind words and good wishes he has expressed in all of your names, and I beg your pardon above all for any inconvenience caused by the cancellation of our meeting originally planned for last January 25th. I am grateful for your patience and understanding and for accepting the invitation to be here this morning despite the difficulties for our traditional encounter or meeting. Our meeting this morning takes place in the more spacious Hall of Blessings in order to respect the need for greater personal distancing demanded by the pandemic. Nevertheless, this distancing is merely physical. Today's meeting speaks of something very different. It is a sign of the closeness and mutual support to which the family of nations should aspire. In this time of pandemic, the need for such closeness is all the more important, for it is evident to everyone that the virus knows no barriers, nor can it easily be isolated. Overcoming it is thus a duty incumbent on each one of us, personally, as well as our countries. I am most grateful for your daily efforts to foster relations between your countries or international organizations that you represent and the Holy See. We have been able to exchange many signs of our closeness to one another in the course of these past months, thanks also to the use of new technologies that have allowed us to surmount the limitations imposed by the pandemic. All of us certainly look forward to resuming personal contact as quickly as possible, and our gathering here today is meant to be a sign of hope in that regard. I myself wish to resume my apostolic visits, beginning with that to Iraq, scheduled for this coming March. These visits, in fact, are an important sign of the solicitude of the successor of Peter for God's people spread throughout the world, as well as the dialogue of the Holy See with states. These visits also frequently provide an opportunity to promote, in a spirit of sharing and dialogue, good relations between the different religions. In our time, interreligious dialogue is an important component of the encounter between peoples and cultures, when it is viewed not in terms of compromising our own identity, but as an occasion of mutual understanding and enrichment. Dialogue can become an opportunity for religious leaders and the followers of different confessions, and can support the responsible efforts of political leaders to promote the common good. Equally important are international agreements that foster mutual trust and enable the Church to cooperate more effectively in the spiritual and social well-being of your countries. In this regard, I would mention the exchange of instruments of ratification of the framework agreement between the Holy See and the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and the agreement on the legal status of the Catholic Church in Burkina Faso, as well as the signing of the 7th additional agreement of the 23rd of June 1960 Convention regulating patrimonial relations between the Holy See and the Republic of Austria. In addition, on the 22nd of October 2020, the Holy See and the People's Republic of China agreed to extend for another 2 years the provisional agreement regarding the appointment of bishops in China, signed in Beijing in 2018. The agreement is essentially pastoral in nature, and the Holy See is confident that the process now begun can be pursued in a spirit of mutual respect and trust, and thus further contribute to the resolution of questions of common interest. Dear ambassadors, this year, just ended, has left in its wake fear, unease, and despair, as well as grief for the great loss of life. It led to a spirit of isolation and mutual suspicion that caused states to set up barriers. The interconnected world to which we had become accustomed gave way to a world once more fragmented and divided. Yet, the effects of the pandemic are themselves global, touching all the countries and peoples of the world, affecting numerous aspects of our lives, and helping to aggravate deeply interrelated crises like those of the climate, food, the economy, and migration. In light of this, I thought it fitting to establish the Vatican COVID-19 Commission for the sake of coordinating the response of the Holy See and the entire Church to requests coming from dioceses worldwide to respond to the health crisis and the serious needs that the pandemic has brought to the fore. From the outset, it seemed obvious that the pandemic would have a significant effect on the style of life to which we were accustomed, and on conveniences and certainties we took for granted. This led to a crisis, for it showed us the face of a world that is seriously ill, not only as a result of the virus, but also in its natural environment, its economic and political processes, and even more in its human relationships. The pandemic shed light on the risks and consequences inherent in a way of life dominated by selfishness and a culture of waste. And it set before us a choice, either to continue on the road we have followed until now, or to set out on a new path. I would like to mention briefly some of the crises that were provoked or were brought to light by the pandemic, but also to consider the opportunities that they offer for the building of a more humane, just, supportive, and peaceful world. The health crisis. The pandemic forced us to confront two unavoidable dimensions of human existence: sickness and death. In doing so, it reminded us of the value of life, of every human life and its dignity at every moment of its earthly pilgrimage, from conception in the womb until its natural end. It is painful, however, to note that under the pretext of guaranteeing presumed subjective rights, a growing number of legal systems in our world seem to be moving away from their inalienable duty to protect human life at every one of its stages. The pandemic has also reminded us of the right of each human being to dignified care, as I emphasized in my message for the World Day of Peace, celebrated on the 1st of January this year. For each human person is an end in him or herself, and never simply a means to be valued only for his or her usefulness. Persons are created to live together in families, communities, and societies where each member is equal in dignity. Human rights derive from this dignity, as do human duties, like the responsibility to welcome and assist the poor, the sick, the excluded. If we deprive the weakest among us of the right to life, how can we effectively guarantee respect for every other right? I thus renew my appeal that every person receive the care and assistance he or she requires. To this end, it is indispensable that political and government leaders work above all to ensure universal access to health care, incentivizing the creation of local medical clinics and healthcare structures that meet people's actual needs, as well as the available of treatments and medicinal supplies. Concern for profit should not be guiding a field as sensitive as that of healthcare. It is likewise essential that the remarkable medical and scientific progress attained over the years, which made it possible to create so quickly vaccines that promise to be effective against the coronavirus, benefit humanity as a whole. I encourage all states to contribute actively to the international efforts being made to ensure an equitable distribution of the vaccines, based not on purely economic criteria, but on the needs of everyone, especially of the people most in need. Even so, before so devious and unpredictable an enemy as COVID-19, access to vaccines must be accompanied by responsible personal behavior aimed at halting the spread of the virus, employing the necessary measures of prevention to which we have become accustomed in these months. It would be disastrous to put our trust in the vaccine alone, as if it were a panacea, exempting every individual from constant concern for his or her own health and for that of others. The pandemic has once more shown us that, in the celebrated expression of the English poet John Donne, no man is an island, and any man's death diminishes me, because I am involved in mankind. The environmental crisis, nor is it just human beings that are ill. The pandemic has demonstrated once again that the earth itself is fragile and in need of care. Certainly, there are profound differences between the health crisis resulting from the pandemic and the ecological crisis caused by the indiscriminate exploitation of natural resources. The latter is much more complex and long-lasting and requires shared long-term solutions. In fact, the impact of climate change, for example, whether direct, such as the extreme weather events of flooding and drought, or even indirect, such as malnutrition or respiratory diseases, entail consequences that will persist for a considerable time. Overcoming these crises demands international cooperation in caring for our common home. It is thus my hope that the next United Nations Climate Change Conference, the COP26, planned to take place in Glasgow this coming November, will lead to an effective agreement in addressing the consequences of climate change. Now is the time to act, because we are already feeling the effects of prolonged inaction. I think, for example, of the repercussions of climate change on numerous small islands in the Pacific Ocean that are in danger of gradually disappearing. This tragedy not only causes the destruction of entire villages, but also forces local communities, especially families, to be constantly displaced with the loss of their identity and culture. I think, too, of the floods in Southeast Asia, especially in Vietnam and the Philippines, which have caused many deaths and left entire families without means of subsistence. Nor can I fail to mention the increased warming of the earth, which has caused devastating fires in Australia and California. In Africa, too, climate change, aggravated by reckless human intervention and now by the pandemic, is a cause of grave or serious concern. I think particularly of food insecurity, which in the last year has especially affected Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, with millions of people suffering from hunger. In South Sudan, too, there is a risk of famine and, indeed, a serious and persistent humanitarian emergency. Over 1 million children are undernourished, while humanitarian corridors are often blocked and the presence of humanitarian agencies in the territory is restricted. Not least to deal with this situation, the South Sudanese authorities urgently need to overcome misunderstandings and pursue political dialogue for the sake of full national reconciliation. An economic and social crisis. The need to contain the coronavirus has prompted many governments to adopt restrictions on freedom of movement. For several months, these have led to the closing of businesses and a general slowdown in production, with serious repercussions on companies, especially those that are medium-sized and small, unemployment, and consequently on the life of families and entire sectors of society, especially those that are most fragile. The resulting economic crisis has highlighted another illness of our time, that of an economy based on the exploitation and waste of both people and natural resources. All too often, we have neglected solidarity and other values that make it possible for the economy to serve integral human development rather than particular interests. We have also lost sight of the social significance of economic activity and the universal destination of goods and resources. The current crisis thus provides a helpful opportunity to rethink the relationship between individuals and the economy. There is a need for a kind of new Copernican revolution that can put the economy at the service of men and women and not vice versa. In a word, a different kind of economy, one that brings life, not death, one that includes and does not exclude, one that humanizes and not dehumanizes, one that cares for the environment and does not despoil it. To cope with the negative consequences of this crisis, many governments have prepared various initiatives and allocated substantial funding. Yet not infrequently, attempts have been made to seek local solutions to a problem that is in fact global.
Occorrono iniziative comuni, iniziative condivise e anche a livello internazionale, soprattutto.
Today, more than ever, we can no longer think of acting simply as ourselves. Common and shared initiatives are also needed at the international level, especially to support employment and to protect the poorest sectors of the population. I consider to be significant in this regard the commitment of the European Union and its member states. Despite difficulties, they have been able to demonstrate that it is possible to work diligently to reach satisfactory compromises for the benefit of all citizens. The allocation of funds promised by the Next Generation EU Recovery Plan can serve as a meaningful example of how cooperation and the sharing of resources in a spirit of solidarity are not only desirable, but also achievable goals.
In molte parti del mondo la crisi ha interessato soprattutto quanti lavorano nei settori informali, i quali sono stati i primi a vedere scomparire.
In many parts of the world, the crisis has predominantly affected those working informally, who were the first to see their livelihood vanish. Living outside of the formal economy, they lack access to social safety nets, including unemployment insurance and health care provision. Driven by desperation, many have sought other forms of income and task, and risk being exploited through illegal or forced labor, prostitution, and various criminal activities, including human trafficking.
Al contrario, ogni essere umano ha diritto e deve essere messo in condizione di ottenere i mezzi indispensabili e sufficienti per un dignitoso tempo.
Every human being, on the other hand, has the right to enjoy the means necessary for the proper development of life and must be given the means to do so. Indeed, economic stability must be ensured for all, so as to avoid the scourge of exploitation and to combat the usury and corruption that afflict many countries in the world, together with the many other injustices that occur daily under the weary and distracted gaze of our contemporary society.
Ha portato pure a stare più a lungo in modo alienante davanti al computer e ad altri mezzi di comunicazione, con gravi ricadute sulle persone più vulnerabili, specialmente i poveri e disoccupati.
The increased amount of time spent at home has also led to greater isolation as people pass longer hours before computers and other media, with serious consequences for the more vulnerable, particularly the poor and the unemployed. They become easier prey for cybercrime in its most dehumanizing aspects, including fraud, trafficking in persons, the exploitation of prostitution, including child prostitution and child pornography.
ha accentuato anche diverse emergenze umanitarie, tanto nelle zone di conflitto quanto nelle regioni colpite dal cambiamento climatico e dalla siccità, nonché nei campi.
The closing of borders due to the pandemic, combined with the economic crisis, have also aggravated a number of humanitarian emergencies, both in conflict areas and in regions affected by climate change and drought, as well as in refugee and migrant camps. I think especially of Sudan, where thousands of people fleeing the Tigray region have sought refuge, as well as other countries in sub-Saharan Africa or in the Cabo Delgado region in Mozambique, where many have been forced to leave their own lands and now find themselves in highly precarious conditions. I also think of Yemen and Syria, where in addition to other serious emergencies, a large part of the population experiences food insecurity and children are suffering from malnutrition. In various cases, humanitarian crises are aggravated by economic sanctions, which more often than not affect mainly the more vulnerable segments of the population rather than political leaders. While understanding the reasons for imposing sanctions, the Holy See does not view them as effective and hopes that they will be relaxed, not least to improve the flow of humanitarian aid, especially medicines and healthcare equipment, so very necessary in this time of pandemic. May the current situation likewise be a catalyst for forgiving or at least reducing the debt that burdens the poorer countries and effectively prevents their recovery and development. Last year also witnessed a further increase in migrants, who as a result of the closing of borders had to resort to ever more dangerous travel routes. This massive flow also met with a growing number of illegal refusals of entry, frequently employed to prevent migrants from seeking asylum in violation of the principle of non-refusal. Many of those who did not die while crossing seas and other natural borders were intercepted and returned to holding and detention camps where they endured torture and human rights violations. Humanitarian corridors implemented in the course of the last years surely helped to confront some of these problems and have saved many lives. Yet, the scope of the crisis makes it all the more urgent to address the root causes behind why individuals migrate. It also demands a common effort to support the countries of first welcome that assume the moral duty to save human lives. In this regard, we look forward to the negotiation of the European Union's new Pact on Migration and Asylum, while noting that concrete policies and mechanisms will not work unless they are supported by the necessary political will and the commitment of all parties involved, including civil society and migrants themselves.
La Santa Sede apprezza tutti gli sforzi compiuti in favore dei migranti e appoggia l'impegno dell'Organizzazione Internazionale.
The Holy See appreciates every effort made to assist migrants and supports the commitment of the International Organization for Migration, presently celebrating the 70th anniversary of its foundation in full respect for the values expressed in its constitution and of the culture of the member states in which the organization works. Likewise, the Holy See, as a member of the Executive Committee of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, also known as the UNHCR, remains faithful to the principles laid down in the Geneva Convention of 1951 on the status of refugees and in the Protocol of 1967, both of which set forth the legal definition of refugees, their rights, and the legal obligation of states to protect them. Since the aftermath of the Second World War, our world has not experienced such a dramatic increase in the number of refugees as we do today. Consequently, there is an urgent need for a renewed commitment to protect them, together with internally displaced persons and the many vulnerable people forced to flee from persecution, violence, conflicts, and war. In this regard, despite the important efforts made by the United Nations in seeking solutions and concrete proposals to address in a consistent manner the issue of forced displacement, the Holy See expresses its deep concern over the situation of displaced persons in different areas of the world. I refer primarily of the central region of the Sahel, where in less than 2 years the number of internally displaced persons has increased 20-fold. Political crisis.
Le criticità che ho fin qui evocato pongono in rilievo una crisi ben più profonda.
The critical issues that I have just mentioned highlight a much deeper crisis, which in some way lies at the root of the others, and whose dramatic force was highlighted precisely by the pandemic. I refer to the political crisis, which has been affecting many societies for some time, and whose painful effects emerged during the pandemic. Our Holy Father now pausing for a water break.
Uno dei fattori emblematici di tale crisi è la crescita delle contrapposizioni politiche e la difficoltà.
There has been a growing trend, one that is becoming more and more widespread also in countries with a long tradition.
È una tendenza.
And one of the hallmarks of this crisis is the increase in political conflicts and the difficulty, if not actually the inability, to seek common and shared solutions to the problems afflicting our world. This has been a growing trend, one that is becoming more and more widespread, also in countries with a long tradition of democracy. Vitalizing democracies is a challenge in the present historic moment, one that directly affects all states, whether small or large, economically advanced, or in the process of development. In these days, my thoughts turn particularly to the people of Myanmar, to whom I express my affection and closeness.
Il cammino verso la democrazia intrapreso negli ultimi anni è stato bruscamente interrotto dal colpo di Stato della settimana scorsa.
The path to democracy undertaken in recent years was brusquely interrupted by last week's coup d'etat. This has led to the imprisonment of different political leaders who I hope will be promptly released as a sign of encouragement for a sincere dialogue aimed at the good of the country.
Pio XII nel suo memorabile radiomessaggio del Natale del 44.
As Pope Pius XII stated regarding this in his memorable radio message of Christmas 1944, and he quotes, "To express their own views of the duties and sacrifices that are imposed on them, and not to be compelled to obey without being heard, these are two rights of citizens which find in democracy, as its name implies, their expression." End of quote. Democracy is based on mutual respect, on the possibility that each person can contribute to the good of society, and on the consideration that different opinions do not threaten the power and security of states, but through honest debate, mutually enrich them and enable them to find more suitable solutions to pressing problems.
Che si persegua un cammino di dialogo inclusivo, pacifico.
The democratic process requires the pursuing of the path of inclusiveness, peaceful, constructive, and respectful dialogue among all the components of civil society in every city and nation. The events that in various ways and contexts from east to west have marked this past year, also, as I mentioned, in countries with a long democratic tradition, have made clear how inescapable is this challenge and how we cannot avoid the moral and social duty to address it positively.
Lo sviluppo di una coscienza democratica esige che si superino I personalismi.
The development of a democratic consciousness demands that emphasis on individual personalities be overcome and that respect for the rule of law prevail. Indeed, law is the indispensable prerequisite for the exercise of all power and must be guaranteed by the responsible governing bodies, regardless of dominant political interests. Sad to say, the crisis of politics and of democratic values is reflected also on the international level, with repercussions on the entire multilateral system and the obvious consequence that organizations designed to foster peace and development on the basis of law and not on the law of the strongest, see their effectiveness compromised. To be sure, we cannot ignore that the multilateral system has also in recent years shown some limitations. The pandemic is a precious opportunity to devise and implement structural reforms so that international organizations can rediscover their essential vocation to serve the human family by protecting individual lives and peace.
Ad intraprendere percorsi di riforma. Non bisogna avere paura delle riforme, anche se richiedono sacrifici e non di rado un cambiamento di mentalità. Ogni corpo vivo ha bisogno continuamente.
One of the signs of the crisis of politics is precisely the frequently encountered reluctance to undertake paths of reform. We must not be afraid of reform, even if they require sacrifices and often a change in our way of thinking. Every living body constantly needs to be reformed, and the reforms taking place in the Holy See and the Roman Curia also fit into this perspective. In any case, there are a number of encouraging signs, such as the entry into force a few days ago of the Treaty for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, and the extension for another 5-year period of the new Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, also known as New START, between the Russian Federation and the United States of America. As I noted in my recent encyclical letter, Fratelli Tutti, if we take into consideration the principal threats to peace and security with their many dimensions in this multipolar world of the 21st century, not a few doubts arise regarding the inadequacy of nuclear deterrence as an effective response to such challenges. In fact, a stability based on fear, when it actually increases fear and undermines relationships of trust between peoples, is not sustainable. Efforts in the area of disarmament and the non-proliferation of nuclear weapons that, despite difficulties and reluctance, must be intensified, should also be carried out with regard to chemical and conventional weapons. Our world has too many weapons. There are too many weapons in the world. Justice, right reason, and the recognition of human dignity cry out insistently for a cessation to the arms race. weren't the arms race. The stockpiles of armaments which have been built up, St. John the 23rd affirmed this in 1963. These stockpiles of armaments which have been built up in various countries must be reduced all around and simultaneously by the parties concerned. As violence increases at every level with the proliferation of weapons, and we see around us a world torn by wars and divisions, we feel an ever greater need for peace, a peace that is not only the absence of war, but rather a life rich in meaning, rooted in and lived through personal fulfillment and fraternal sharing with others. How I wish that in 2021 we might hear the end of the war in Syria. For this to happen, renewed interest is needed, also on the part of the international community, to address the causes of the conflict with honesty and courage, and to seek solutions whereby everyone, regardless of ethnic and religious affiliation, can contribute as citizens to the future of that country. My desire for peace obviously extends to the Holy Land. Mutual trust between Israelis and Palestinians must be the basis for renewed direct dialogue between the parties aimed at resolving a conflict that has gone on all too long. I urge the international community to support and facilitate such direct dialogue without presuming to dictate solutions that would not be aimed at the good of all. Palestinians and Israelis, I am sure of this, share the desire to dwell in peace. I also express my hope for renewed political commitment, both national and international, to foster the stability of Lebanon, which is experiencing an internal crisis and risks losing its identity and finding itself caught up even more in regional tensions. It is most necessary that this country maintain its unique identity, not least to ensure a pluralistic, tolerant, and diversified Middle East in which the Christian community can make its proper contribution and not be reduced to a minority in need of protection. Christians, with their many educational, health, and charitable works, are an intrinsic part of Lebanon's historical and social fabric, and they must be guaranteed the possibility of continuing their efforts for the good of the country of which they were the founders. A weakening of the Christian presence risks destroying internal equilibrium and the very reality of Lebanon. In this regard, the presence of Syrian and Palestinian refugees must also be addressed. Moreover, without an urgently needed process of economic recovery and reconstruction, the country risks bankruptcy, with the possible effect of a dangerous rift toward fundamentalism. It is therefore necessary for all political and religious leaders to set aside their personal interests and to commit themselves to pursuing justice and implementing real reforms for the good of their fellow citizens, acting transparently and taking responsibility for their actions. I likewise express my hope for peace in Libya, itself also devastated by a lengthy conflict, and I trust that the recent Libyan Political Dialogue Forum held in Tunisia last November under the aegis of the United Nations will effectively permit the inauguration of the country's long-awaited process of reconciliation.
Mi riferisco in primo luogo alle tensioni politiche e sociali nella Repubblica Centroafricana.
Other areas of the world are also a cause for concern. I am referring first of all to the political and social tensions in the Central African Republic and to those affecting Latin America in general, which are rooted in profound inequalities, injustices, and poverty that offend the dignity of persons. I also follow with particular attention the deterioration of relations on the Korean Peninsula, which culminated in the destruction of the Inter-Korean Liaison Office in Kaesong, and the situation in the South Caucasus, where several conflicts continue to smolder, some of which flared up in the past year, undermining the stability and security of the entire region.
Infine, non posso dimenticare un'altra grave piaga di questo nostro tempo, il terrorismo.
Finally, I cannot fail to mention another serious scourge of our time, terrorism, which every year kills numerous victims among defenseless civilians throughout the world. Terrorism is an evil that has been growing since the 70s of the last century, culminating in the attacks that took place in the United States of America on September 11th, 2001, that killed nearly 3,000 people. Tragically, the number of terrorist attacks has intensified in the last 20 years, affecting various countries on every continent. I think of terrorist attacks above all in sub-Saharan Africa, but also in Asia and Europe. My thoughts turn to all the victims and their families who have lost their loved ones to blind violence, motivated by ideological distortions of religion. For that matter, the targets of these attacks are often precisely places of worship where believers are gathered in prayer. In this regard, I would like to stress that the protection of places of worship is a direct consequence of the defense of freedom of thought, conscience, and religion, and is a duty incumbent upon the civil authorities regardless of their political persuasion or religious affiliation.
Signore e signori, nell'avviarmi verso la conclusione delle mie
Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, as I come to the end of these considerations, I would like to focus on one last crisis, which is perhaps the most serious of all.
la crisi dei rapporti umani, espressione di una generale crisi
The crisis of human relationships as the expression of a general anthropological crisis dealing with the very conception of the human person and his or her transcendent dignity. The pandemic, which forced us to endure long months of isolation and often loneliness, has brought out the need of every individual for human relationships. I think above all of those students who were unable to attend school or university regularly. Attempts have been made everywhere to offer a rapid response through online educational platforms. These have brought to light a marked disparity in educational and technological opportunities, but they have also made us realize that, due to the lockdown and many other already existing needs, large numbers of children and adolescents have fallen behind in the natural process of schooling. Furthermore, the increase in distance learning has also led to a greater dependence of children and adolescents on the Internet and on virtual forms of communication in general, making them all the more vulnerable and overexposed to online criminal activities. We are witnessing a sort of educational catastrophe. I want to repeat it. We are witnessing a sort of educational catastrophe before which we cannot remain inactive for the sake of generations to come and for a society as a whole. Today there is a need for a renewed commitment to an education that engages society at every level. Education is in fact a natural antidote to the individualistic culture that at times degenerates into a true cult of the self and the primacy of indifference. Our future cannot be one of division, impoverishment of thought, imagination, of attentiveness, of dialogue and mutual understanding. At the same time, long periods of lockdown have also made it possible for families to spend more time together. For many of them, it was an important opportunity to renew their deepest relationships. Marriage and family constitute one of the most precious gifts, one of the most precious of human values, and the foundation of every civil society. The great Pope St. John Paul II, the centenary of whose birth we commemorated last year, noted in his insightful teachings on the family that nowadays, and this is a quote, nowadays, given the global dimension of various social questions, the family has seen its role in the development of society expanded in a completely new way. By presenting to their children a model of life based on the values of truth, freedom, justice, and love, end quote. Even so, not everybody has been able to live with serenity in his or her own home, and some forms of cohabitation have degenerated and led to domestic violence. I encourage everyone, civil and public authorities, to provide support to the victims of domestic violence. Unfortunately, as we all know, women, often with their children, are those who are paying the highest price. The need to halt the spread of the virus has also had implications for a number of fundamental freedoms, including religious freedom, restricting public worship, and the education on charitable activities of faith communities. It must be recognized, however, that religion is a fundamental aspect of the human person and of society and cannot be eliminated. Even as we seek ways to protect human lives from the spread of the virus, we cannot view the spiritual and moral dimension of the human person as secondary to physical health. Freedom of worship, furthermore, is not a corollary of the freedom of assembly. It is, in essence, derived from the right to freedom of religion, which is the primary and fundamental human right. This right must therefore be respected, protected, and defended by civil authorities, like the right to bodily and physical health. For that matter, sound care of the body can never ignore care of the soul.
Scrivendo a Can Grande della Scala Dante Alighieri, sottolinea il fine.
In his letter to Can Grande della Scala, Dante Alighieri states that the purpose of his comedy is, quote, to remove those living in this life from the state of misery and to lead them to the state of bliss, unquote. This is also the work of both religious and civil authorities in their various sectors and responsibilities. The crisis in human relationships and consequently the other crises I have mentioned cannot be overcome unless we safeguard the transcendent dignity of each human person created in the image and likeness of God. In mentioning the great Florentine poet, the 700th anniversary of whose death occurs this year, I would also like to address a special thought to the people of Italy, who were the first in Europe to deal with the grave effects of the pandemic. I urge them not to lose heart amid the present difficulties, but to cooperate, to work together in unity, to build a society in which no one is discarded or forgotten. Dear ambassadors, 2021 is a time that must not be wasted, and it will not be wasted if we can work together with generosity and commitment. In this regard, I am convinced that fraternity is the true cure for the pandemic and for the many evils that have affected us. Fraternity and hope are the medicines that we need in today's world, along with vaccines. Upon each of you and your respective countries, I invoke abundant heavenly blessings and add my prayerful good wishes that this year may be a fruitful occasion for deepening the bonds of fraternity that unite the entire human family. Thank you. The diplomats here in the Aula della Benedizione, applauding the discourse of His Holiness Pope Francis on the occasion of his meeting with them at the beginning of the calendar year 2021, an annual event that takes place generally toward the beginning of the year. And now, I would like to greet each one of you, and we'll do it with a few precautions. We're not going to shake hands. And since there is a distance, let's greet each other one by one with a smile, also with a smile from the heart. And it's not necessary to have the mask. Each one is free to wear the mask or not, as long as we keep the distance. And in this way, we can greet each other. And so our Holy Father now on his feet, the diplomats now beginning to line up. The first to greet our Holy Father is the Dean, who addressed him at the beginning, George Poulides, the ambassador representing Cyprus. And with these images, we now bring to a conclusion this live broadcast of our Holy Father's annual meeting with the diplomatic corps accredited to the Holy See. And I invite you to visit the Vatican News web portal, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube accounts for coverage of today's address. You can also find the full discourse at the Vatican.va website. You'll also be able to find other Vatican and world news at the Vatican News web portal. On behalf of Vatican Media, I would like to thank all of the technicians who have made this broadcast possible today, and for all of you for joining us. Our next live broadcast will be on Wednesday morning. Our Holy Father's general audience begins at 9:30. That's Rome time. Laudetur Jesus Christus. Praised be Jesus Christ.
Are you looking for life-changing entertainment? Does what you see on most channels leave you feeling unfulfilled? Well, look no further. Shalom World TV brings the peace and joy of Jesus Christ to you, whether at home or on the go. To start watching, you don't need antennas, cable connections, or a dish. You probably already have what you need if you have a smart TV, such as a Samsung, LG, or Panasonic, or if you have one with an Android, Opera, or Roku TV operating system. These can be found on the latest models of Sony, Toshiba, Vizio, Philips, RCA, Sharp Aquos, TCL, Insignia, Element, Hitachi, Vestel, Skyworth, Changhong, Konka, and Hisense. You can also watch Shalom TV on most IPTV streaming devices, starting with the 4th generation of Apple TV and Roku, Amazon Fire TV, Mi Box, Amino, Humax, or on TiVo Box through the Opera TV store. Are you a gamer or virtual reality enthusiast? We've got you covered. Shalom World is on Xbox One, Razer Forge, NVIDIA Shield, and HoloLens. To start watching, all you have to do is go to the App Store, download Shalom World, and start being fulfilled by content that brings you into a deeper relationship with Jesus Christ. For more information on how to watch Shalom World on your TVs and devices, visit us at shalomworld.org/connectedtv. Have a smartphone or tablet? Take Shalom with you wherever you go. Again, by downloading Shalom World from the App Store. If you prefer to watch from your Mac or PC, get the Shalom World desktop app. Or you can always watch from our website, shalomworld.org. And guess what? Shalom World is absolutely free on all of these platforms. Yes, free. There are no download charges and no in-store app purchases required, ever. If you're looking for life-changing entertainment, you found it. It's here, waiting for you on your Shalom World.